Leonardo DiCaprio. For most, the name alone conjures images of timeless cinema. The boy with arms wide on the Titanic, the cunning Jordan Belfort, the haunted survivor in The Revenant. But beyond the applause and golden statues, behind the carefully curated frames on screen, lies a man who spent decades learning to live between love and loneliness, light and shadow, and shaped by forces far beyond his understanding. His first breaths were drawn in Los Angeles, California, on November 11th, 1974. A city of dreams. Yes, but also a city where dreams can break before they ever bloom. His mother, Ermeline Indenbirken, a determined legal secretary of German descent, was the pillar of his young life. Her pregnancy felt like a divine signal, especially when, during a quiet visit to an Italian museum, she stood before a painting by Leonardo da Vinci and felt her baby kick for the very first time. That moment sealed his name and perhaps his destiny. Leonardo, a name tied to brilliance, to art, to something larger than life. But even destiny can feel fragile when reality arrives early. Just over a year after his birth, his parents' marriage dissolved. There was no dramatic scandal, no explosive fallout, just the quiet breaking of a bond that once felt unshakable. George DiCaprio, his father, was an underground comic book artist, magnetic and unconventional, and he had fallen for someone else. Yet, George didn't vanish. He stayed close, both literally and emotionally. In an arrangement as poetic as it was painful, Leonardo's parents lived in neighboring homes connected by a shared garden. The young boy moved between them like a bridge, carrying pieces of each world with him, never quite able to belong fully in either. In one home, he was Ermeline's boy, her little shadow, trailing her down the cracked sidewalks of Los Feliz. In the other, he was George's son, enraptured by the creativity and free spirit of his father and captivated by his stepbrother, Adam Ferrer, a boy who became both idol and escape. This patchwork life was tender in intent, but uneven in execution. Los Angeles in the late 1970s and early 80s was not the polished playground that tourists imagine. It was raw, chaotic, and unpredictable. The scent of gasoline hung in the air. Sirens howled through the nights, and graffiti didn't decorate. It scarred. Even as a child, Leonardo sensed danger. Not always visible, but always present. "You learn to keep your head down," he later said, "and to dream of somewhere else." School offered no reprieve. Though he showed sparks of intelligence and imagination, the structure of public education felt like a prison. At the Los Angeles Center for Enriched Studies and later John Marshall High School, Leonardo felt confined, boxed in by beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights. His spirit, restless and alive, struggled to breathe in such a cage. "I hated public school with a passion," he admitted years later. But behind that statement was something deeper, a profound sense of disconnection. He wasn't just a boy who didn't enjoy school. He was a boy who didn't feel seen, a child moving between homes, living on the edge of financial security, watching his mother sacrifice daily to hold their fragile world together. He understood instability long before most kids understood the meaning of the word. By the age of 10, he could already read a room with the sensitivity of a seasoned adult. He sensed the simmering tension in hushed arguments. He recognized the weight behind his mother's smiles. And he began to build armor, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. The charming, luminous smile that would later captivate millions? It began as a defense mechanism, a way to let people in just enough but never too far. And yet, even in this uneven world, there was resilience, an undercurrent of fierce, unconditional love. Ermeline, tireless and unwavering, drove him across Los Angeles for auditions, believing with every fiber of her being that her son's spark was meant to shine. George, untraditional but passionate, filled Leonardo's mind with avant-garde art, counterculture, and radical ideas. He exposed his son to a world far beyond their neighborhood, a world where dreams could become blueprints for survival. These two halves, his mother's stability and his father's wildness, formed the foundation upon which Leonardo would build his future. They were the dual engines that propelled him forward, even when the odds leaned hard against him. As a young boy, Leonardo pressed his face against the window of their small apartment, gazing out at streets lined with hardship. He knew separation. He felt the ache of people leaving and the void left behind. He saw the silence that followed once laughter had drained from a room. But more than anything, he felt hunger, not just for food or fame, but for something higher, something that could lift him beyond the limitations of his surroundings. Even before he became an actor, Leonardo was performing, not for fame, not for fortune, but for survival. At just 2 years old, in 1976, he wandered onto a stage during a small community festival. His steps were unsure, but his presence was undeniable. He moved with such freedom, such innocent confidence, that the crowd erupted in laughter and applause. It was a fleeting moment, but it planted a seed. I still remember the way they laughed. He later recalled, "Not at me, but with me. It felt electric." This was the first spark of the fire that would one day light up the biggest stages in the world. But before the Oscars, before the millions, before the yachts and red carpets, there was a boy, barefoot in the streets of Los Angeles, juggling auditions, disappointments, and a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build something beautiful from the fragments of his childhood. And he would. But the cost would be higher than anyone could imagine. By the mid-1980s, Leonardo's ambition had begun to outgrow the quiet streets of Los Feliz. The boy who once felt caged in classrooms now longed for a stage, any stage, to set himself free. His early performances weren't on Hollywood sets, but in the unlikeliest places: family gatherings, impromptu skits in the living room, even breakdancing battles during a trip to Germany. At just 10 years old, he won second place in a local breakdancing competition, a seemingly playful detour, yet another spark that hinted at his innate gift for performance. But the road from gifted child to working actor was no fairy tale. In fact, it was brutal. Between 1988 and 1990, Leonardo endured a grueling stretch of rejections. He knocked on every door, walked into every room with a hopeful smile, only to walk out with nothing but silence. Producers found him too energetic, too wild, too much. One even suggested he change his name to Lenny Williams to sound more American. But Leonardo, with his father's unwavering support, refused. He would not dilute his name. He would not compromise who he was for the comfort of casting directors. Authenticity became his quiet rebellion and his greatest weapon. Slowly, the doors began to open. Small roles at first. He watched, he listened, he learned. While others saw them as gigs, he treated them as masterclasses. One of his earliest obsessions was River Phoenix, the brilliant young actor who had portrayed the same role in the film version of Parenthood. Leonardo would study Phoenix's performance obsessively, replaying scenes in his head until they lived under his skin. It wasn't imitation, it was devotion. He wanted to understand the soul beneath the lines, the humanity behind every glance. This desire to embody truth rather than mimic behavior would become the cornerstone of his craft. Yet success remained elusive. For every role he landed, there were dozens he lost. He and his mother would drive home in silence after auditions that ended in polite rejection. She masked her worry with gentle words. He masked his heartbreak with resilience. These were not glamorous years. They were years of grit and quiet desperation. Years that taught him that dignity isn't found in applause, it's found in persistence. By 1991, at just 17, Leonardo DiCaprio stepped onto a film set for the first time to shoot Critters 3. It was a low-budget horror comedy, far from Oscar material. Years later, he'd laugh about it, calling it possibly the worst film I've ever done. But in truth, that role was sacred. It was his entry point, his first taste of what it felt like to carry a movie, however small. It taught him humility and patience, two virtues that would shape his approach to fame later on. Then came the moment everything changed. In 1993, he landed the role of Tobias Wolff in This Boy's Life, starring opposite Robert De Niro and under the direction of Michael Cotton Jones. The film was raw, emotional, and deeply challenging. DiCaprio, barely 19, was tasked with portraying a troubled teenager caught between survival and rebellion. It was a role that demanded more than just talent. It demanded honesty. Robert De Niro, known for his intensity and precision, became an unexpected mentor. He taught me to listen, Leonardo recalled, not just to my lines, but to the spaces between them. It was on that set that DiCaprio shed the habits of a young TV actor and began the slow transformation into a true craftsman. That same year, he delivered a performance that would catapult him into the global spotlight. In What's Eating Gilbert Grape, he portrayed Arnie Grape, a boy with a developmental disability. It was not just a performance, it was an immersion. Audiences didn't see an actor. They saw Arnie. So convincing was his portrayal that many assumed he wasn't acting at all. At 19, he earned his first Academy Award nomination, and with it came a strange, surreal validation. It felt like being invited to a table you never thought you'd sit at, he said. But recognition is a double-edged sword. With it comes pressure. With it comes expectation. In 1996, he stepped into a role that would define a generation, Romeo and Juliet. Director Baz Luhrmann reimagined Shakespeare's timeless tragedy in a kaleidoscope of color and chaos, and Leonardo's Romeo burned with teenage yearning. His boyish face, his wounded eyes, his urgent declarations of love. Every moment felt etched in fire. Then, in 1997, the world changed. Titanic set sail. At 22, Leonardo DiCaprio became Jack Dawson, the penniless artist with a spirit too wild to be tamed, a dreamer who stood on the bow of a doomed ship and opened his arms to the sky. Paparazzi lenses trailed his every movement. Tabloids chronicled his relationships, his vacations, even his silences. Teen magazines called him the dream of a generation, and fans waited for hours just to catch a glimpse of his shadow. But while the world celebrated Jack Dawson, Leonardo quietly mourned the loss of his freedom. Titanic had made him immortal, but at a cost. At just 23, he stood at a dangerous crossroads. He could either ride the wave of fame into a life of comfort and repetition, or he could disappear, reinvent, and take control of his narrative. Few actors at his level would risk walking away, but Leonardo did. In the years that followed Titanic, it was with the force of someone reborn. In Catch Me If You Can, he played Frank Abagnale Jr., a charming young con artist who slips through the fingers of the law with wit and vulnerability. DiCaprio proved that he could lead a major studio film without leaning on romance. But it was Gangs of New York, released the same year, that signaled a tectonic shift. Under the direction of Martin Scorsese, Leonardo transformed into Amsterdam Vallen, a man driven by vengeance, navigating the blood-soaked streets of 19th century Manhattan. Standing toe-to-toe with Daniel Day-Lewis, one of the most formidable actors alive, Leonardo didn't flinch. He held his own, delivering a performance laced with rage, grief, and searing intensity. He portrayed Billy Costigan, an undercover cop drowning in lies and fear. It was a performance steeped in exhaustion and moral anguish, a man teetering on the edge of collapse. And then came Revolutionary Road, 2008, reuniting him with Kate Winslet, not as lovers on a sinking ship, but as a married couple suffocating in suburbia. Their love wasn't epic, it was eroding. It was raw, uncomfortable, and achingly real. The chemistry remained, but this time it was laced with resentment and despair. The film was a masterclass in emotional excavation, and Leonardo held nothing back. But for all the daring choices and critical acclaim, there remained a phantom that haunted him, the Oscar. Time and again, he was nominated. Time and again, he lost. With each loss came headlines dissecting his reaction, speculating on what it meant, as if failure to win was failure to matter. "You tell yourself it doesn't matter," he once said, a wry smile curling his lips. But it does. It always does. It became a cruel irony. The more he stretched himself, the more he risked, the more the Academy seemed to look elsewhere. The public made a running joke of it, but for Leonardo, each near miss was another silent bruise. He never showed bitterness. He never lashed out. Instead, he pressed forward, knowing that his worth couldn't be measured by a golden statue, even if part of him still longed to hold it. Then came The Revenant, 2015. It wasn't just a film, it was a crucible. Leonardo crawled through freezing rivers, endured bone-chilling temperatures, and spent long days in the Canadian wilderness, sometimes eating raw bison liver, pushing his body to its limits. There were few lines, few comforts, only survival. But in that silence, in that suffering, something profound happened. He didn't just act, he transcended. And finally, the Academy acknowledged it. In 2016, after more than 2 decades of heartbreak and patience, Leonardo DiCaprio's name was called. Best Actor, The Revenant. The standing ovation wasn't just for the performance. It was for the journey, for the years of endurance, for the refusal to give up. It wasn't just an Oscar, one critic wrote. It was a reckoning. And yet, even after winning, Leonardo didn't grow complacent. He didn't settle. In Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, 2019, he played Rick Dalton, a fading actor terrified of being forgotten. It was his most vulnerable role in years. Not physically grueling like The Revenant, but emotionally devastating. There was no mask this time, just a man confronting his own irrelevance, looking into the abyss of a world that had moved on. In Don't Look Up, 2021, he took on the absurdity of modern society, holding up a mirror to a world distracted by headlines, denial, and fleeting fame. And in 2023, he reunited with Scorsese once again in Killers of the Flower Moon, a performance so quiet, so devastating, it didn't need a shout. It simply lingered. Awards came. Accolades followed. He was named to Time's 100 Most Influential People. He received global honors. But behind the curtain, Leonardo remained unchanged in one vital way: his hunger. The more authentically he portrayed the human condition, the more the public demanded to know about his own life. But Leonardo had learned, sometimes the hard way, that what you share, the world will try to own. And so, he held tightly to what little remained of his privacy. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't post his thoughts on social media. He avoided drama, refused to entertain rumors, and when necessary, used legal action, not to make a statement, but to protect the part of his life that didn't belong to Hollywood. Because for Leonardo, the boundary between truth and spectacle had become razor thin. He had spent years watching whispers become headlines, glances turn into gossip, and silences stretched into speculative monologues. A moment of laughter at a private dinner could become a tabloid cover. A quiet walk with a friend was suddenly a romance. The cost of fame wasn't just intrusion, it was distortion. After Titanic, he had become an icon of youth and romance. But he knew better than anyone how easily those labels hardened into expectations. The world wanted him to remain Jack Dawson forever. Young, idealistic, full of love. But Leonardo had no interest in remaining a symbol. He wanted to be an artist, a truth teller, a man who stepped into characters not for applause, but for meaning. So he made the choice few stars dare to make. He refused to give the world more than he could live with losing. Still, it wasn't easy. When The Revenant won him the Oscar, the world cheered. But behind the applause was something quieter, something Leonardo carried with a private ache. He once confessed, "Fame, it gives you everything, and takes just as much." He wasn't speaking about money or roles. He was speaking about selfhood, about how, the more people believed they knew him, the more he had to retreat just to remember who he actually was. By his mid-40s, Leonardo had become a paradox. A man recognized everywhere who lived like someone constantly trying to disappear. He bought homes not just for luxury, but for solitude. Estates tucked behind high hedges. Islands far from paparazzi drones. Spaces where he could hear his own breath without it being echoed by headlines. He had created a world where he could move silently, and yet silence carried its own weight. He had wealth, more than most could imagine. A collection of properties across Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, Malibu, a private island where he hoped to build an environmentally sustainable resort. a garage filled with electric cars, conscious choices that reflected his environmental advocacy. And yet, despite it all, the very things that protected him also made him feel farther from the world. Luxury can be isolating. When every home is gated, when every room echoes, when every conversation is weighed for what might be leaked or twisted, it becomes harder and harder to let people in. And this loneliness, though rarely spoken about publicly, invented narratives mocked his love life as a punchline. But what they failed to see was the truth beneath the surface. Leonardo wasn't avoiding love. He was protecting it. He believed in it deeply. He even confessed once that his ultimate hope was to be a father one day. But he also understood the weight of what it meant to bring someone into his life. How do you build something tender when every corner of your world is under surveillance? Those close to him say he has always longed for something real, but his reality makes real hard to hold on to. He gave them presents instead, and when the spotlight burned too brightly, he vanished, only to return, once more, through a character on screen. He lived in cycles, intense, transformative performances followed by long stretches of absence. Some mistook it for arrogance. Others called it detachment. But those closest to him knew the truth. It was preservation. Because every role he took demanded a piece of him. Not just energy, not just time, but spirit. That's what made his work different. When he became someone else on screen, he didn't act from the outside in. He pulled from his bones. From the ache of watching his parents separate. From the weight of growing up between two homes. From the fear of being ordinary. From the loneliness of a life in which everyone knew his face, but few ever knew his heart. This is why, even after decades, Leonardo's performances still hit like thunder. Whether he was screaming in a forest, whispering through clenched teeth, or standing perfectly still in grief, his presence never felt artificial. It felt lived in. And yet, the older he grew, the more the world demanded answers about his personal life. Why wasn't he married? Would he ever settle down? Was he afraid of growing old alone? These questions followed him like shadows, always there, always unspoken in interviews, always loudly speculated in gossip columns. But Leonardo, true to his pattern, never answered directly. Instead, he kept working, producing films through his company, Appian Way, supporting environmental causes through the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, using his influence not to increase his fame, but to elevate voices that might otherwise be ignored. He became a bridge between entertainment and activism, between luxury and responsibility. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, always trying, to make his presence mean something. He once said, "If you're lucky enough to be able to choose your work, then you owe it to the world to choose it wisely." And he lived by that. Every script, every director, every risk was chosen with precision. And every role, no matter how grand or brutal, he walks them with grace, but never with indulgence. Unlike many of his peers, he doesn't chase the spotlight. In fact, he often moves away from it, content to let the work speak while he disappears into the background. When he does speak, it's usually for a cause. Climate change, conservation, indigenous rights. His voice, once reserved only for scripts, now echoes in conferences, documentaries, and campaigns. He has long understood the currency of his fame, and he chooses to spend it wisely. While other celebrities build empires around their personal brands, Leonardo builds awareness around global crises. The irony, of course, is that the same man who once played Jack Dawson, the romantic idealist whose love story shook the world, is now one of the most emotionally guarded figures in Hollywood. His love life, despite endless speculation, remains veiled in discretion. The relationships, the photographs, the rumors, they all come and go. But Leonardo never confirms, never denies. Echoes from a time when film was mythic and fame didn't come with flashing cameras in every shadow. Yet, the accumulation of these things doesn't hide the truth. Even in beauty, there can be loneliness. Those who've worked with him say he's deeply focused, often intense, but also warm in quiet ways. He remembers names. He listens. He shows up prepared. He builds trust on set not through charisma, but through commitment. His reputation isn't built on charm. It's built on consistency. Directors call him fearless. Co-stars call him generous. Assistants call him kind. But off-set, he remains an enigma. He rarely courts attention. He avoids personal interviews. He has no social media presence that speaks in his own voice. Every public image of him is filtered through someone else's lens. And perhaps that's how he prefers it. Because Leonardo DiCaprio didn't choose acting to be known. He chose it to discover. And that's what separates him. He's not performing for the audience. He's reaching for something deeper, some truth that might not even have words. That's why when he weeps on screen, it feels real. When he shouts, it cuts. When he goes silent, the silence speaks louder than lines. His legacy is not in his fame. It's in his ability to make others feel, to make them remember. One of the most private souls in an industry built on exposure. As Leonardo crossed into his 50s, the conversation around him began to shift. No longer was it just about the films or the roles. It was about legacy. What would he leave behind? What had it all meant? The awards, the fame, the fortune, where did they lead? For most people, turning 50 is a milestone marked with family, shared stories, maybe even a sense of slowing down. But for Leonardo, 50 arrived not with stillness, but with questions. And not from others, from within. He had built a life that appeared untouchable. His net worth, estimated to be around $300 million, was the result of decades of carefully chosen roles, back-end deals, endorsements, and investments. He wasn't just an actor. He was a brand, a producer, an environmental advocate, and an icon whose name had outlived trends. His power in Hollywood was no longer speculative. It was institutional. But behind that power was a man who still walked home to silence. His homes were stunning, his possessions rare, but the echo of footsteps in those homes was often only his own. And for all the sparkle of his career, there remained a quiet ache in his personal life, a space that no award, no yacht, no headline could fill. There's an old saying, the higher you rise, the fewer people you can take with you. And perhaps Leonardo, more than most, came to understand that deeply. His foundation had donated tens of millions to causes around the world. Wildlife preservation, indigenous rights, clean water, disaster relief. His passion for the planet was unrelenting. He once said, "If I weren't an actor, I'd be a full-time environmentalist." And many believe that even as he continues to act, that's exactly what he already is. Still, for all his global influence, Leonardo remains surprisingly human in his fears. Aging in Hollywood, especially as someone whose youth had once been idealized by billions, was no easy feat, but he didn't fight it. He didn't try to relive Jack Dawson or cling to old roles. Instead, he leaned into it, self-aware and brutally honest. And in that role, perhaps more than any other, Leonardo let the world glimpse his own anxieties. Because no matter how successful, how admired, or how wealthy, no one is immune to time. He began to measure his life differently, not by premieres or headlines, but by how much of himself he could keep intact. He chose projects more selectively, chose collaborators who challenged him, directors who pushed him. He refused to settle into safe choices. Every film had to scare him a little. Every role had to make him earn it. And still, when the work ended, when the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, he returned to a world he had crafted carefully, with barriers, with boundaries, with space. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson Leonardo had learned through fame, how to stay intact in a system built to consume you. His friendships remained few but loyal. His circle, small and trusted. He didn't chase relevance. He didn't indulge in social media performance. He didn't respond to gossip, didn't correct lies unless they became dangerous. In a time when everything is visible, Leonardo made invisibility his armor. He wasn't trying to be mysterious. He was trying to stay whole. Because behind the polished suits and the collected art and the critical acclaim, there still lived the boy who watched his parents separate before he could understand why. The teenager who saw his mother struggle to keep the lights on, too known, too consumed by others to fully recognize yourself. Leonardo DiCaprio, perhaps more than any actor of his generation, lives within that paradox. He walks between two worlds. In one world, he is immortal, his face frozen in celluloid memory, spanning decades of cinema. The boy on the bow of the Titanic. The cunning con man slipping through the fingers of the law. The haunted frontiersman fighting for survival in a frozen wilderness. The investor, the revolutionary, the lover, the mad genius. His characters are remembered not as performances, but as people, real, flawed, unforgettable. In that world, he is cheered, awarded, remembered. But in the other world, the real one, he walks mostly alone. There, he is not Jack Dawson or Jordan Belfort. He is just Leonardo, a man in his 50s, a man who has seen the best and worst of what fame has to offer. A man who knows that the same world that once adored you for your youth and beauty will one day whisper that you've lost both. And yet he has not chased youth. He has embraced age with grace, letting the lines settle on his face, letting the fire in his eyes deepen rather than dim. His recent performances show a maturity that cannot be faked, a world weariness that cannot be performed. His face has become not just a canvas for characters, but a reflection of time, etched with experience. He chooses when to show himself and when to vanish. He gives everything on screen and almost nothing off it. His silence is not detachment. It is survival. It's a silence born from understanding that everything said can be twisted, every smile captured, every moment turned into meaning it never intended to carry. And yet, that silence also isolates him, because in order to protect the most sacred parts of himself, he must also deny others access to them. He once said in a rare interview, "If you give them too much, they'll take everything." He wasn't speaking bitterly. He was speaking truthfully, fearing the loss of relevance. Leonardo brings something unspoken to every role, a piece of himself. Not the celebrity, not the icon, but the man. The boy from Los Feliz. Lives, and then returns, not for attention, but because there is still a story left to tell. He produces more now, using his platform to uplift other voices, younger filmmakers, new visions. His production company, Appian Way, has become a quiet force in shaping meaningful cinema. Not commercial noise, but work that matters, work that stays. And yet, for all his creative control, for all his discipline, there is still the matter of his heart. It is the one domain that remains a question mark. Unsettled, not in scandal, not in loss, but in space. In the absence of something definitive. The partners have come and gone. The whispers have risen and faded. But Leonardo has never placed a ring on a finger, never announced a wedding, never become a father. Not because he couldn't, but perhaps because, for someone who has spent his entire life performing for the world, the most personal role of all, partner, he endured them in silence. When it demanded more of him than any man should give, he simply gave what he could and protected the rest. Because Leonardo DiCaprio is not chasing legacy. He's building it with every frame, every risk, every refusal to compromise. He has turned down fortune for art, turned away from comfort to pursue craft. And in doing so, he has built something few ever do, a life that is not dictated by others. But even he knows, time waits for no one. And as the roles slow, as the pace shifts, the spotlight softens. He has begun to look inward more often than outward. He speaks less, retreats more. The parties are fewer, the public sightings rarer, and when he does appear, it is often in the service of something larger than himself, a cause, a film, a purpose that feels meaningful. Not for the sake of legacy, but for the sake of love, for the joy of watching someone grow, of giving what he never fully had, a complete, uninterrupted presence. Whether that dream comes to pass remains unknown. But if it does, it won't be for the cameras. It will happen in silence, as most of Leonardo's most important decisions do. In private, in stillness, without announcement or applause. Because the most meaningful chapters are often the ones the world never sees. And maybe that's how it should be. For now, Leonardo continues forward, quietly, steadily, choosing roles that matter, using his platform with care, living not loudly, but deliberately. He is no longer the boy from Los Feliz, running from casting room to casting room, hoping to be seen. He is no longer the heartthrob who made the world fall in love with Jack Dawson. He is not even just the actor who finally held the Oscar in his hand after decades of trying. He's something rarer, a man who survived what few can, a man who gave himself to his art without losing himself entirely, a man who, even now, but when those lights go down and the makeup is wiped away and the suit is hung back in the wardrobe, what remains? A man who has lived more lives on screen than most do off it. A man who has loved, lost, wandered, returned. A man whose face is recognized in every country, but whose voice we rarely hear outside of characters. A man who, even at 50, is still becoming. His commitment to the planet, for instance, is not performative. It is rooted in decades of learning, listening, and acting. Long before climate change became a trending headline, Leonardo was funding documentaries, sitting with scientists, supporting indigenous communities, and lobbying governments. His 2016 Oscar acceptance speech wasn't about his win. It was about the Earth. And that wasn't an act. It was the culmination of years of advocacy. He used the biggest moment of his career to shine a light on something beyond himself. That is who he is. And that is why his fame matters. Because Leonardo DiCaprio is not just a product of Hollywood. He is an amplifier of causes that go ignored. He is the rare artist who uses his platform not to glorify his own image, but to elevate the world's understanding. And yet, even in that giving, there remains something profoundly solitary about him. But out of reverence. Because some things like grief, like longing, like hope, can't be captured by headlines or photographs. They must be lived in the shadows of the spotlight, in the corners of empty rooms, in the pauses between dialogue. And perhaps that's why, despite the glamour, despite the wealth, despite the near-mythic status he now holds, Leonardo still feels. Of choosing fewer roles when offered everything. Of stepping away when most would rush toward the light. It's a legacy of knowing when to act and when not to. That kind of control isn't easy. Not in an industry that thrives on relevance. Not in a world where attention is currency. But Leonardo's greatest performance may be the one we've never seen. The performance of a man who, and plays, but always with the awareness that every step could become a story he never wrote. And so, over the years, he has built a kind of armor. One made not of detachment, but discipline. Because Leonardo knows, once you belong to the world, the only thing left to own is yourself. In that self-possession, he has found space, literal and emotional. The homes he owns are sanctuaries. Aboard yachts that feel like floating fortresses, he drifts not for decadence, but for disconnection, from noise, from expectations, from identity itself. And it's there, in those rare, unobserved moments, that Leonardo may be closest to himself. The man who dreams of being a father, but never rushed into fatherhood. The man who loves deeply, but has yet to find someone to walk with for life's final stretch. The man who can command a room of 10,000, yet often chooses the company of only a few. His friends describe him not as aloof, but as observant. Not as cold, but as cautious. He listens more than he speaks. He watches more than he performs. And when he does speak, when he does give himself fully, whether in a role or a rare public statement, it resonates because we know he doesn't give it lightly. And that's what keeps the audience coming back. Not just to the theaters, but to him. Because even after all this time, Leonardo DiCaprio still feels like a story half told. Still feels like a man mid-transformation. Still feels like he's holding something back. Not out of deception, but out of deep, quiet care. There's a sense that the most powerful version of Leonardo hasn't been revealed yet. Not the actor, not the activist, but the man. The one who, when the lights are off and the cameras are packed away, looks in a mirror and wonders what comes next. Not as a performer, but as a person. Because the truth is, for all the scripts he's read, all the scenes he's memorized, all the awards he's accepted, there's one story that only he can write. His own. At 50, Leonardo DiCaprio's life no longer revolves around chasing the next big role. Instead, it's about protecting what he's earned, preserving who he is, and preparing for what's still unwritten. He no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. Not the critics, not the Academy, not the industry that once questioned his depth. He has proven it all. And yet, his journey continues. Not toward more fame, but toward a kind of peace that no fame can offer. He has reached a level of stillness that few celebrities ever manage. Not because the world has stopped watching, but because he has stopped performing when he doesn't have to. He no longer tries to control the narrative. He lets people talk. Let them wonder. Let them piece together his life through photographs, headlines, and speculation. Because what they're looking at is only the surface. The real Leonardo lives somewhere far deeper. There's a quiet defiance in the way he lives now. He appears when it matters. He disappears when it doesn't. He says no more than he says yes. And perhaps most powerfully of all, he says nothing at all when the world demands a statement. Because silence, in Leonardo's world, is not absence. It is power. It is dignity. It is the only way to hold onto himself in a world that asks for everything. He could have been anyone. He could have chased everything. He could have followed the path of so many others, burned bright, burned out, and been remembered only in fragments. But instead, he chose patience. He chose resilience. He chose to carry the weight of greatness quietly and with grace. Now, as he reflects on the decades behind him, Leonardo knows that the true cost of his career was never paid in hours or energy. It was paid in privacy, in intimacy, in the parts of himself that could never be fully known. Not because he hid them, but because he chose to protect them. He has watched love come and go. Not because he lacked the ability to love, but because the noise around his name made quiet connection nearly impossible. He has watched friends grow families, build routines, settle into lives less watched. And though he has everything the world calls success, there are moments, late at night, behind closed doors, when he wonders what it might feel like to be anonymous. To walk into a cafe without a second glance. To hold someone's hand without it becoming a headline. To grow old with someone who doesn't see the actor, the icon, or the image, but simply the man. And maybe, just maybe, he's still holding out hope for that. Because if there's one thing Leonardo hasn't given up, it's the belief in love. Not the red carpet kind, not the magazine cover version, but the quiet, enduring kind that stays even after the camera cuts. He's seen what fame can offer. He's seen what it can destroy. And now, more than ever, he is choosing what to hold close and what to release. What matters to him now is not being remembered for being the youngest, or the richest, or even the most talented. What matters is being remembered for the truth, for the way he made people feel something, for the moments in film where he held up a mirror to humanity and said, "This is what it's like to be broken. This is what it's like to want more. This is what it's like to be alive." Because beneath all the glamour, beneath the carefully curated career, Leonardo DiCaprio has always been reaching for something more real than any role. And even now, as the lights dim and the applause fades, he is still reaching. Not for the next film, not for the next trophy, but for something deeper, something lasting, something human. As the decades pass and the spotlight shifts toward newer faces, Leonardo DiCaprio remains, a fixture not of noise, but of gravity. He is no longer just a star. He is a force. And like all forces, he cannot be contained by headlines or trophies or tabloid stories. He moves quietly, deliberately, shaping not just film, but culture. And yet, despite all that he's accomplished, what lingers most about Leonardo isn't a single scene or film. It's the feeling he leaves behind. The pause after the credits roll, the silence in the theater, the ache you can't explain. Because Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't just entertain, he imprints. There's a moment, if you look closely, when he slips out of character and reveals something else, something real. A flicker of pain, a flash of longing, a glance that says more than 1,000 lines. It's that moment that stays with us. That moment that reminds us we're watching a man who's not just pretending to feel, but who has felt, who does feel, who carries 1,000 lives within him and still walks as one. At 50, Leonardo DiCaprio is not a finished story. He is a living contradiction, a man both open and impenetrable, seen by millions, known by few, loved on screen, guarded in life. A global icon who has managed, somehow, to remain his own. And maybe that is his greatest accomplishment of all, that through decades of acclaim, expectation, and obsession, he never gave the world more of himself than he was willing to lose. He once said that the hardest part of his life wasn't acting. It was learning how to live without being consumed by the world's gaze. And in that, he has quietly triumphed. Because Leonardo DiCaprio has lived not just as an actor, but as a man who refused to let the story write him. Instead, he wrote his own, one role at a time, one risk at a time, one decision, silent or loud, public or private, at a time. And so we watch, not because we're waiting for a fall, not because we crave another scandal, but because we believe that in Leonardo's quiet journey, we see something of ourselves. The longing, the searching, the hope that maybe, just maybe, it's possible to give the world your gifts without losing your soul. So when the cameras stop rolling and the sets are struck and the crowds go home, Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't vanish. He simply walks away, not from the work, but into the quiet, to rest, to reflect, to prepare for whatever comes next. And perhaps, just perhaps, to finally play the one role he's never had the space to fully live. The one where he doesn't perform at all, where he isn't Jack Dawson, or Howard Hughes, or Jordan Belfort. Deeply human, he might give the world the most unforgettable performance of all,